I'm 41, and I own a barbershop in the Bronx. 3 chairs, 2 barbers besides me, and a waiting area with a TV that's been showing the same news channel since 2014 because nobody can find the remote, and at this point it's tradition. I want to talk about my father because I just found out something about him that reframed 30 years of my life in about 45 seconds. My dad was a quiet man. Dominican, came to New York in 1979, worked in a garment factory in Midtown for 26 years until it closed. He never complained about the work. He never complained about anything, actually, which I used to think was strength and now I think was something more complicated. When I was a kid, every Friday he'd come home with a brown paper bag that he'd put on top of the refrigerator. My mom never touched it. I asked about it once, and she said, "That's your father's business." The bag was always gone by Monday. This went on for years. I assumed it was money he was saving, or something private, or maybe something I was better off not knowing. My dad died in 2021. Heart attack. Very sudden, very unfair. He was 68 and still walked 2 miles every morning. At his funeral, a man I'd never seen before came up to me and introduced himself as Alejandro. He said he'd worked with my dad at the factory. Alejandro was polite, said the usual things, then handed me an envelope. Inside was a note from my father, written in Spanish, that said, "For Miguel, when I'm gone. Ask Alejandro to explain." I called Alejandro 2 weeks later. He told me the story. Every Friday for over 20 years, my father had taken part of his paycheck and put it in that brown bag. Every Saturday morning, he'd take the bag to a woman named Carmen who lived in Washington Heights. Carmen was a single mother with 3 kids who my dad had known from his hometown in the Dominican Republic. She'd come to New York in the early 80s with nothing, and her husband had left her almost immediately. My father gave her money every week for 23 years. Not a lot, 20, 30, sometimes $50 when he could manage it. He never told my mother the full story because Carmen's ex-husband was my mother's cousin, and he didn't want to create family drama. So he just quietly kept this woman and her kids from going under, week after week, with a brown paper bag on top of the refrigerator. Carmen's kids are all adults now. One's a nurse. One works for the city. One owns a restaurant in the Heights. Alejandro told me that Carmen died in 2018, 3 years before my dad, and that at her funeral, her children talked about a man named Rafael who had helped their mother every week without ever asking for anything. My father's name was Rafael. They didn't know his last name. They just knew him as the man with the brown bag who came on Saturdays. I sat in my barbershop after that phone call and stared at the chair I cut hair in every day. My father made less money than I do. He had a family to feed. And every week, without telling anyone, he carved off a piece of what he had and gave it to someone who needed it more. I'm 41 years old. I've been trying to figure out what kind of man my father was my whole life, and it turns out the answer was sitting on top of the refrigerator every Friday. I just never looked inside the bag. I started leaving an envelope at Carmen's daughter's restaurant every month. No name on it. Just cash. The waitress asked me once who it was from. I said, "Rafael." Some things don't need a last name.